Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Today's topic is one that has been suggested in my comments section a few times. I have got a big list of video suggestions that have come in across my social media platforms and via email. All of these suggestions are real corkers and I think you are going to really enjoy them when they appear on the channel. A few of these have been suggested, frankly, ages ago, but I've been holding them back for something pretty special that I hope I can let you know about very soon. As the title of this video probably indicates, today we're going to look at the life of Mary, Duchess of Richmond. I have mentioned her in passing in a previous video that I made about her husband, Henry Fitzroy. He was Henry VIII's son by Elizabeth Blount. In that earlier video, which I will leave linked, I present a counterfactual history about what I think might have happened if only Henry Fitzroy had lived longer. And one of the things that I do suggest is that he might have been the person who was able to claim the throne of England following the death of his half-brother, King Edward VI, in 1553. Thus, and I am willing to acknowledge that I am stretching things a bit here, today we are going to take a look at a woman who, if things had been different, might have been Queen of England. Mary Howard, as she was born, was the daughter of Thomas Howard, later 3rd Duke of Norfolk, and his second wife Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the daughter of Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham, and Eleanor Percy. Edward, through his mother, Catherine Woodville, was the nephew of Elizabeth Woodville and King Edward IV, meaning that he was the first cousin once removed of King Henry VIII. Edward's father was the Duke of Buckingham who had rebelled against King Richard III, and who was executed as a traitor for it. Eleanor, meanwhile, could claim descent from King Edward III, through his son John of Gaunt's relationship with Catherine Swynford. I have made a video on this relationship that I will leave linked. As for Mary's father, Thomas was a descendant of royalty too, albeit a fairly distant one. His ancestors nevertheless included King John and King Edward I. Thomas's first wife was Anne, and she was the sister of Elizabeth of York. This made him King Henry VIII's uncle by marriage. He was also the uncle by blood of two of Henry's future wives, Anne Boleyn by his sister Elizabeth and Catherine Howard by his brother Edmund. On top of this, Thomas Howard was one of the most influential politicians and courtiers in Henrician England. And so, when Mary Howard was born in around 1519, there were few families better placed or connected than hers. As was common for children of the nobility, plans for her future marriage began while she was still young. Beverly A. Murphy explains that there had been early discussions about a marriage between Mary and John de Vere. He was the heir to the Earl of Oxford, and these discussions were happening prior to the end of 1529. So, if Mary's birth date is correct, and it is debated, she would have been around 10 at this point. While there was certainly a noble tradition for marriages being arranged earlier than this, even as early as when the children were in the cradle, it was not the expectations that this couple, engaged young, would be living as a married couple in every sense of that term until they were both much older and also had been deemed to be sufficiently physically developed for it to be safe for them to do so. Any plans for this de Vere match that may have been underway seem to have been quickly shelved when the possibility of Mary marrying Henry Fitzroy was floated. As it was, Mary and Henry would marry on the 26th of November 1533. As Mary's maternal grandfather was the first cousin once removed of Henry Fitzroy's father, this couple were deemed to require a dispensation to marry, since they were found to be in the 4th degree of consanguinity. Thomas Howard would assert that Henry VIII had been the one who suggested this marriage should take place. Thomas's wife Elizabeth, however, saw it as resulting from Anne Boleyn's influence, and this is often presented as being a principal reason for her opposition to the match. Elizabeth had served in the household of Catherine of Aragon from the very start of her time as queen in 1509. She was, it seems, devoted to her royal mistress, a woman who became her close friend. Indeed, she remained loyal to Catherine throughout the annulment crisis. She was even exiled from court in 1531 because, according to Eustace Chapuis, quote, "She spoke too freely and declared herself more than they liked for the Queen." When Anne was crowned on the 1st of June 1533, her Aunt Elizabeth refused to attend. Thomas Howard had taken a mistress in 1527, much to his wife Elizabeth's displeasure. This couple had seemingly enjoyed a respectful and loving marriage prior to this point. I think it must have stung when their niece Anne, in her new role as queen, chose to welcome Thomas's mistress to court to serve her as one of her ladies-in-waiting. The marriage would ultimately break down acrimoniously. Elizabeth complained that her husband had locked her up and taken away all her jewels. She also alleged, as Michael A.R. Graves explains, quote, that while she was in labour with their daughter Mary in 1519, he had dragged her by her hair out of bed and around the house, wounding her in the head with his dagger. Thomas Howard strongly denied that this had ever taken place, and there was no one willing to come forward to corroborate Elizabeth's account of it. As for Mary, while her mother was embroiled in courtly and domestic conflict, she found herself nestled right at the heart of the Boleyn faction. Mary was at her cousin Anne's side on the 1st of September 1532. She accompanied her for her creation as Marquess of Pembroke. Mary was then also selected to form part of Anne's royal household once she became queen. Mary's brother, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, appears to have become concerned about his sister and the fact that he thought she was following too much in the Queen's example and in her interest in the new religion. He warned Mary about her pursuit of scriptural study, for example. We don't know which ladies attended Anne during her first confinement for the birth of Elizabeth, but it's possible that Mary may have been thought old enough to be included among those ladies in waiting who would attend upon the Queen at this time. I mean, after all, Mary would soon be a wife herself. Certainly, she would be on hand to play a significant role at the christening of Elizabeth on the 10th of September 1533. She was chosen to, quote, bear the chrism of pearl and stone. The chrism being a white robe or cloth, anointed with consecrated oil that was placed on or over a baby at their baptism to act as a sign of their innocence. I'm assuming that this chrism, as it's described as being of pearl and stone, was ornamented with pearls and gems. Just over 2 months after this christening, Mary would marry Henry Fitzroy and would thus become the Duchess of Richmond. These newlyweds were both around 14 years old and were reportedly deemed to be too young for their marriage to be consummated at this time. Despite her youth, Mary was, however, clearly a woman of keen intellect and taste. This was not only in evidence through her studies of the scriptures, but also through her interest in the poetic arts. Both before and after her marriage, she was involved in the creation of the so-called Devonshire manuscript. Emily Zerevich, writing for JSTOR Daily in 2022, presents this manuscript in the following terms. Quote, Thomas Wyatt, the possible paramour of Anne Boleyn, Lady Margaret Douglas, the daughter of the Queen Dowager of Scotland, Mary Shelton, a mistress of England's King Henry VIII, and Henry Stuart, Lady Margaret's son who married Mary Queen of Scots. These were some of the most fascinating figures and accomplished writers at the English court in the mid-16th century. If one wishes that their poetry could be accumulated into a single volume, that wish is already granted. Their writing makes up the so-called Devonshire manuscript, offering contemporary readers a glimpse of the intellectual and emotional life at the Tudor courts. Its creation is attributed to the scholarly noblewoman Mary Fitzroy, née Howard. A notebook was passed around Howard's circle of acquaintances, several of whom, both men and women, scribbled in their best lines, favourite poems from the medieval era, and critiques of one another's efforts. The manuscript is made up of around 185 verse works. some fragmentary and some complete poems. Soon after her marriage, there was also the intention that Mary should have her portrait painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. This preparatory sketch is how far that commission managed to get. It is thought that this project may have been brought to a halt by the death of Henry Fitzroy on the 23rd of July 1536. He and Mary had been married for nearly 8 months. Their marriage, though, remained unconsummated. Fitzroy's death was part of a string of blows to Mary's place at court and to the esteem with which her family was held. Around 2 months before his death, on the 19th of May 1536, Mary's cousin, Queen Anne Boleyn, had been executed at the Tower of London following a conviction for treason. Then, just a few days before the death of Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII learned that Mary's uncle, Thomas Howard, who was her father's half-brother, yes, the father that was also called Thomas because apparently, of the many attributes the Howard family had, imagination in naming children was lacking. Anyway, Mary's uncle Thomas had sought to secretly marry Henry VIII's niece, Lady Margaret Douglas, the daughter of his elder sister, Margaret Tudor, and also the close friend of Mary Fitzroy. With both of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, now rendered illegitimate, Henry was out of heirs. Margaret Douglas had a very good claim to the throne of England, and so this secret marriage could be read as a Howard making a play for the throne. Henry VIII was not happy about this, and so he promptly imprisoned the couple in the Tower of London. As Margaret's dear friend, and as Thomas's niece, Mary was suspected of assisting this couple in their pursuit of this secret relationship and plotted marriage. After Henry Fitzroy's death, Mary returned to her family home of Kenninghall. Henry VIII was unwilling, apparently, to see her recompensed as his son's widow might expect, or indeed have right to be. She had trouble acquiring the jointure that was arguably due to her as Fitzroy's widow. There is some debate over whether Henry VIII's unwillingness to see Mary provided for was due to her marriage to his son not being consummated, or because of the distrust that he had begun to view her and indeed her family with, or indeed whether it was some combination of the two. Her situation soon became unenviable. She accrued debts and found that she was left with no choice but to sell her jewels in order to support herself. In the meantime, she fought for what should have been hers by right. She was, it seems, not willing to back down on this. Mary's father, perhaps looking for a means to stop all this wrangling over his daughter's jointure, thought that another marriage should be sought for her. In 1538, the suggestion, approved by the king, was that Mary should marry the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour. This was Sir Thomas Seymour, who would later marry Catherine Parr. Mary was, though, not willing to remarry. She would simply not give up her claims to that which was her due as Dowager Duchess of Richmond. When this scheme was brought up again in 1546, she again refused. Mary, I think, is showing herself to be determined to set her own course. There was a revival in Howard favour in the early months of 1539, which resulted in valuable grants beginning to make their way to Mary. Indeed, Beverley A. Murphy explains that, quote, by 1540, the accumulation of her grants assured her a jointure worth over £700 a year. Mary would be named, alongside Lady Margaret Douglas, as those who were intended to wait upon Anne of Cleves when she became Henry's fourth wife and queen in 1540. Mary was also at court following Henry VIII's subsequent marriage to her other cousin, Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard's fall and eventual execution in 1542 represented yet another blow to Henry VIII's trust in the Howard family as a whole. In 1546, with the king's health failing and his suspicions rising, the Howards found themselves in real trouble. This monarch's pre-existing distrust was coupled with the court's reforming faction looking to disempower, even destroy, the Conservatives. Mary's brother, it was reported, had decided to quarter the royal arms in his own device. This was, it was said, evidence of his treasonous ambition. Henry Howard and his father were promptly imprisoned in the Tower of London on the 12th of December 1546. Among those who would give evidence that would count against them was Mary. However, scholars do dispute how damning her evidence was, and or whether it can be said that it was her intention for them to be condemned. Either way, they were. Henry Howard was executed on the 19th of January 1547. Mary's father's life was only spared by the death of King Henry VIII on the 28th of January 1547. Although his life was spared, he would remain incarcerated. In the aftermath of her brother's death, Mary took custody of his children, and it appears that she was very focused on the course their upbringing should take. For example, she chose for them to be tutored by a leading Protestant scholar, John Fox. She was also offering her patronage to another important scholar of the new religion, John Bale. Despite all of this, and despite her frankly long-standing reforming credentials, which arguably dated all the way back to her time studying the scriptures in Queen Anne Boleyn's apartments, if they did not exist before that, Mary did not enjoy the expressed trust or favour of the new regime around King Edward VI. Perhaps, though, this might in part be explained by her continuing to petition them for the release of her father. Could it be that these pleas were far more concerning to the government of the day than her apparent devotion to the new religion was reassuring for them? Well, she may have thought so, as on Christmas Eve 1549, she sent the evangelical bishops of Lincoln, Rochester and St David's to pray with her father in the Tower. Was she perhaps hoping that this would inspire him to fall in line with the new religion estate? In any case, this plan would be unsuccessful, and Thomas would remain in prison for the rest of the reign. When Edward VI's half-sister Mary claimed the throne in July 1553, she soon set about undoing her brother's and her father's faith changes. She would release and pardon Thomas Howard in August 1553, and would see to it that his act of attainder would be lifted a few months later. After his release, Thomas took custody of his grandchildren away from their aunt, his daughter Mary. John Fox was promptly dismissed. In the spring of the following year, Fox would choose to leave England for a self-imposed exile on the continent. Mary Fitzroy would behave similarly, albeit she would not travel quite so far. As Murphy points out, Mary decided it would be best if she, quote, maintained a tactful distance from court. Mary and her last surviving brother Thomas were the only children of Thomas Howard that were still alive when he died at Kenning Hall on the 25th of August 1554. Mary herself would die a little over a year afterwards, towards the end of 1555. She was probably only in her late 30s at this point. So what do you think of Mary Fitzroy? Would she have made a good queen if my counterfactual history had played out in the way I suggested? What do you make of her faith, of her learning and her patronage, of her relationships with her family members and her in-laws? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. But I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will help to boost the engagement. And the more engagement the video gets, the more YouTube shares it out, and that will help us to grow our community. As we've been talking about Mary Fitzroy, I wonder, perhaps a rose for her marriage into the Tudor family? If you think she would have made a good queen, maybe a crown? Or perhaps you think she was very lucky and probably should have been imprisoned a long time before. Maybe pick a tower for that. You can find me elsewhere on social media. I'll leave links to all the places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? If you like the channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you are subscribed, do have a little check now, just to make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button, and then select all in the drop down that will appear, and that way YouTube allege. They will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I'm next planning to go live, which I do to talk about the history news, and you are not going to want to miss that. We have, of course, got our failsafe. If you head to my website, which will be linked, www.katrinamarchant.com, as you can see, if you go to the contact page, on the contact page there's a little box. Put your email in that box. That will add you to my mailing list so I can send you out an email once a week to let you know what I've been up to and also to provide you with useful links that you might want for my content over the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.